Good afternoon to you all. At the outset, let me thank the director of the Center for Banking Studies for inviting me to do this presentation. Under Section 35 of the Monetary Law Act, there is a requirement for the Monetary Board to submit to the Minister of Finance an annual report on the condition of the central bank and a review of policies and measures adopted by the board during the financial year and an analysis of economic and financial circumstances which prompted those policies and measures. In terms of this provision, this is the 69th annual report of the Monetary Board of the Central Bank for the year 2018. The annual report consists of 2 volumes. Volume 1, Part 1, deals with the state of the economy, its performance, policies, and issues. Part 1 also has a statistical appendix and a special statistical appendix with time series data. Volume 2 consists of Part 2, Part 3, and 4. Part 2 has the accounts and operations of the central bank. Part 3, the major administrative measures adopted by the board and the government relating to the functions and operations of the central bank and banking institutions in Sri Lanka. Part 4 has major legislative enactments of 2018 relating to the functions and operations of the central bank and banking institutions. I would like to cover the following topics in my outline. This is my outline. I will first give a snapshot of the economy, then talk about sectoral developments with regard to the real, monetary, fiscal, external, and financial sectors. Then I will present the medium-term outlook, talk about issues and policies, and box articles in the annual report. Starting with the snapshot, in the real sector, inflation remains subdued. Headline inflation and core inflation in both in NCPI and CCPI terms both decelerated. Real GDP growth moderated to 3.2%. Favorable weather conditions supported the recovery in agriculture activities. The unemployment rate increased to 4.4%. In the external sector, the trade deficit amounted to US $10.3 billion. The current account deficit was at US $2.8 billion, which was 3.2% of GDP. The Sri Lanka rupee depreciated by 16.4% in 2018. Gross official reserves, as at end of 2018, were US $6.9 billion. However, policy measures adopted to curtail imports strengthened the external sector in early 2019. In the fiscal sector, the primary balance generated a surplus for the second consecutive year. The surplus was 0.6% of GDP. The budget deficit was 5.3% of GDP. And central government debt increased to 82.9% of GDP. In the monetary sector, the central bank ended its tight monetary policy stance and adjusted to a neutral monetary policy stance in 2018. However, market interest rates remained elevated. Growth of monetary aggregates decelerated, although credit to private sector picked up during the latter part of 2018. The financial sector continued to expand moderately without any major macroprudential concerns. The banking sector surpassed the rupees 11 trillion assets mark. Stock market performance remained subdued. Licensed finance companies and specialized leasing companies' performance moderated. Moving on to real sector developments. GDP grew by 3.2% in real terms in comparison to 3.4% in 2017. Growth was supported by the expansion in all 3 sectors, particularly services and agriculture. GDP per capita in US dollar terms marginally decreased from US $4,104 to US $4,102, mainly due to the impact of the rupee depreciation amidst the moderate growth in nominal GDP. If you look at the percentage as of GDP, agriculture sector accounted for 7.7%, industry sector 28.8%, and services 63.5%. Value added in agriculture activities grew by 4.8% in 2018, as against a 0.4% contraction in the previous year. Favorable weather conditions supported the recovery in agriculture activity. Significant production increases were recorded in rice, fruits, spices, and animal production. Industry activities recorded a marginal growth of 0.9% in 2018. The slow growth in industry was largely due to the contraction in the construction sector and also the mining and quarrying sector. However, manufacturing activities recorded a growth of 3% in 2018. Services-related economic activities expanded by 4.7% in 2018. Significant improvements in value addition were recorded in financial service activities, wholesale and retail trade, other personal services, and transportation activities. Petroleum is a commodity that we monitor very closely since petroleum has a big impact on our economy. In 2018, we imported petroleum products to the value of US dollars 4.2 billion. This constituted about 20% of our total imports. We import petroleum products mainly in the form of refined products and crude oil. Oil prices have been rising last year. The annual average price of Brent crude oil in 2018 was US dollars 71.76 per barrel in comparison to US dollars 54.76 per barrel in 2017. Amidst rising global oil prices, a pricing formula was introduced for domestic petroleum products. With the adoption of a cost-reflective pricing formula, domestic petroleum prices were revised periodically from May 2018. This is expected to reduce the losses of CPC. If you look at a sector-wise breakdown on petroleum sales, we see that the transportation sector and the power generation sector account for the bulk of petroleum sales in Sri Lanka. Total petroleum product sales declined in 2018 with a substantial reduction in demand from the electricity sector. This was due to lower fuel oil-based power generation as a result of increased hydropower generation last year. However, petroleum sales to the transport sector grew by 1.8%. This slide shows the performance of electricity, ports, and civil aviation sectors. The electricity generation mix in 2018 consisted of 34% hydro power, 24% fuel oil, 31% coal, and 11% non-renewable energy sources. Total sales of electricity in 2018 increased by 5% to 14,100 gigawatt. Continued losses of the CEB highlight the need for introducing cost-reflective electricity tariffs. The overall performance of port-related services improved in 2018. Cargo handling increased by 11.8%. In container handling, there was a growth of 13.5%, and transshipment container handling grew by 18.2%. The civil aviation sector continued its growth momentum in 2018. Air passenger movements at the Bandaranaike International Airport increased by 9.9% to 10.8 million passengers. Registration of motor vehicles, which increased at a fast pace in early 2018, decelerated towards the end of the year. Total vehicle registrations increased by 6.5% to 480,799 as against a decrease witnessed in 2017. The highest registrations were seen in motor cars, which increased by 106.2%. The increase in total motor vehicle registrations in 2018 was driven by the favorable duty structure applicable to small engine capacity vehicles through the budget 2018. However, as a number of measures were taken to arrest the fast growth of motor vehicle imports, registration of new motor vehicles showed a declining trend towards the end of the year. Initiatives aimed at developing economic infrastructure continued in 2018 amidst fiscal constraints. Government efforts to improve the provision of utilities continued, while appropriate housing facilities were developed for the needy. To facilitate orderly urbanization, numerous projects such as multimodal transport centers were introduced, while projects including the light rail transport project were initiated. The development work of the Colombo Port City project continued, with land reclamation being completed in early 2019. Road development and rehabilitation activities continued as well. Construction work, these included the construction work of the Central Expressway, Phase 3 of the Outer Circular Highway, the Southern Expressway Extension Project, and reconstruction of 13 bridges in the Central and Nuwa provinces. As the limited fiscal space restrains public spending towards enhancing economic infrastructure, facilitating public-private partnerships is important. The government continued to provide health and education services amidst private sector participation. Key highlights of health sector data include, by the end of 2018, there were 613 government hospitals with 3.5 beds for every 1,000 persons in the country. There was one qualified doctor for every 1,035 persons and one nurse for every 599 persons in government hospitals. Government involvement in education continued with private sector participations. Policy initiatives aimed at improving the level of general education continued in 2018. These included 13 years of guaranteed education program, and the nearest school is the best school program. The government, with the support of the private sector, continued to improve accessibility and quality of higher education. Initiatives aimed at reducing poverty and improving well-being continued during 2018. The Samudhi Subsidy Program and the Nutritional Allowance Program to support the overall well-being of vulnerable segments of society continued. In 2018, under the Divinaguma Samudhi Subsidy Program, there were 1,384,021 families registered, and the government spent 39,239 million rupees in terms of for this program. The results of the HIES 2016 of the Department of Census and Statistics reveal that poverty levels in the country, as reflected by the poverty headcount ratio, have further declined to 4.1% from 6.7% in the HIES 2012-13. As per the World Bank classification, 0.8% of the population was below the international poverty line of US dollars 190 per day in 2016. Moving on to monetary sector developments, the central bank signaled an end to the monetary tightening cycle in April 2018 and adjusted to a neutral monetary policy stance during the remainder of the year. The CBSL reduced the SLFR in April 2018, ending the tightening cycle in view of favorable inflation outlook and deceleration in money and credit growth, as expected, amidst subdued economic growth. However, considering adverse developments in global economic conditions and its impact on the domestic economy. The central bank followed a neutral monetary policy stance thereafter. Meanwhile, as liquidity in the domestic money market continued to remain at a large deficit level, the statutory reserve requirement was reduced by a total of 2.5 points in 2 steps in November 2018 and March 2019, with a view to injecting liquidity on a permanent basis. Market interest rates remained elevated in 2018. Overnight interest rate movements reflected the changes in market liquidity conditions and the monetary policy signals of the central bank. Government securities yields increased during the last quarter of 2018, reflecting changes in market sentiment due to political uncertainty, as well as tight domestic liquidity and heightened domestic borrowings. Other market interest rates, including deposit and lending rates of commercial banks, remained high in both nominal and real terms in 2018. The growth of monetary aggregates further decelerated in 2018, continuing the deceleration trend observed in the previous year. The moderate growth in reserve money continued in 2018. Broad money growth, which gradually moderated since late 2017, maintained its decelerating trend during 2018. NDA expansion was mainly due to the expansion in credit to both private and public sector. NFA of the banking system contracted with the decline of foreign reserves of the central bank due to intervention in domestic foreign exchange market amidst capital outflows and lower foreign currency financial position of commercial banks. Credit to the government by the banking system increased substantially in 2018. NCG from the banking system rose significantly by rupees 346.7 billion, particularly in the fourth quarter of the year. Increase in NCG was due to the expansion in credit from both the central bank and commercial banks. Reflecting the increased reliance on bank financing by most state-owned business enterprises, credit to public corporations increased substantially in 2018. Credit obtained by public corporations increased by 218.4 billion compared to an increase of rupees 23.2 billion in 2017. Borrowings by CPC and CEB accounted for around 72% of the overall expansion in credit to public corporations last year. Credit to the private sector by commercial banks grew at a slower pace during the first 8 months of 2018, although some acceleration was witnessed in the last 4 months of the year. Private sector credit growth accelerated to 15.9% by end 2018, with an absolute increase of rupees 762.1 billion. Growth of credit dispersed to the services sector and for personal loans and advances expanded during 2018, while industry and agriculture sector credit moderated. In spite of the sharp depreciation of the rupee and transitory price pressures, inflation remained subdued in 2018 with well-anchored inflation expectations. Headline inflation was broadly on a downward path in 2018. The surge in headline inflation during mid-2018 was explained by cost push factors arising from upward adjustments in domestic petroleum prices and volatile food prices. Headline inflation based on CCPI declined to 2.8% by end 2018 from 7.1% at end 2017, while NCPI headline inflation declined to 0.4% by end 2018 from 7.3% in the previous year. Core inflation remained at low single-digit levels in 2018, reflecting the impact of the relatively tight monetary policy stance maintained during the past years and anchored inflation expectations. our projections indicate that inflation is likely to remain within the 4 to 6% range in 2019 and beyond. Moving on to fiscal sector developments. This shows the base indicators in the fiscal sector. Fiscal consolidation showed a mixed performance in 2018. I will highlight only a few indicators. Tax revenue decreased to 11.9% last year from 12.4% in 2017. Total expenditure decreased to 18.6% of GDP in 2018 from 19.2% in the previous year. The current account balance of the budget was in deficit to the tune of 1.2% of GDP in 2018. The primary balance, however, recorded an improvement. It improved to 0.6% of GDP in 2018 from 0.02% in 2017. The overall budget balance also, the overall budget balance deficit also improved. The deficit was 5.3% of GDP in 2018 in comparison to a deficit of 5.5% in 2017. Central government debt increased to 82.9% of GDP in 2018. Fiscal operations recorded an enhanced primary surplus and a lower budget deficit despite a decline in revenue mobilization during 2018. The primary balance generated a surplus of rupees 91.4 billion last year, as against a surplus of rupees 2.1 billion in 2017. The budget deficit, as mentioned before, improved to 5.3% of GDP in 2018. The current account deficit, which indicates the government's savings, increased to 1.2% of GDP in 2018 from a deficit of 0.7% in 2017. Although a higher surplus in the primary balance is a salutary development, as the government managed to meet its non-interest expenditure entirely out of revenue receipts with a surplus remaining, this was achieved largely through a compression in capital expenditure amidst a decline in revenue. Total revenue declined to 13.3% of GDP in 2018 from 13.6% in 2017. Tax revenue declined to 11.9% of GDP last year from 12.4% of GDP in 2017 due to the lower revenue collections from import duties, VAT, excise duties on petroleum products and liquor, withholding tax, and the cess levy. However, revenue as a percentage of GDP declined due to the reduction in tax revenue, as mentioned before. However, revenue in nominal terms increased by 4.8% to rupees 1,920 billion in 2018. Reforms have been undertaken to improve the tax revenue collection and to promote specific sectors. In 2017, the income tax law was overhauled, and the new Indian Revenue Act number 24 of 2017 was enacted. This new law aims to simplify and rationalize the existing income tax structure, broaden the direct tax base, strengthen administrative powers, and introduce international best practices to the Sri Lanka's tax system. This change in the tax law had a revenue enhancement impact in 2018. Moreover, the Value Added Tax Act was amended in 2018 to grant tax exemptions to identified sectors, and a tourist VAT refund scheme was established to promote the tourism sector. Customs duty was imposed on the importation of gold to discourage the excessive gold imports, and applicable duty on fuel imports was reduced. There were several changes to excise duty. These included the upward revision on excise duty for motor vehicles and the imposition of excise duty on sugar imports. Meanwhile, tax administration was also strengthened. The Revenue Administration Management Information System was upgraded to incorporate the provisions of the Inland Revenue Act number 24 of 2017, and measures were initiated to establish a national single window to facilitate importers and exporters. Total expenditure as a percentage of GDP declined in 2018, reflecting the moderation of public investment. Total expenditure and net lending as a percentage of GDP declined to 18.6% in 2018 from 19.2% in the previous year, mainly due to the decrease in capital expenditure. Capital expenditure reduced to 4.2% of GDP in 2018, while recurrent expenditure as a increased marginally to 14.5% of GDP. However, total expenditure and net lending increased in nominal terms. Public investment in nominal terms, however, declined by 4.9% to rupees 625 billion in 2018, while as a percentage of GDP, public investment declined to 4.3% in 2018 from 4.9% in 2017. Several key expenditure rationalisation measures were undertaken by the government in 2018. These included the submission of quarterly expenditure and income reports to Parliament, the presentation of quarterly budget estimates to the Parliament, automation of the pension process, pension payment process, reviewing and finalizing guidelines for public-private partnerships, submission of performance reports to of the 5 state-owned business undertakings, drafting welfare benefit payment schemes for the 4 main welfare programs, while developing the selection methodology of the welfare payment schemes, and the implementation of the formula-based fuel pricing mechanism. The overall budget deficit in 2018 was largely financed through domestic sources. Domestic financing accounted for 57.5% of total financing. Domestic financing as a percentage of GDP increased to 3% in 2018, while foreign financing was 2.2% of GDP. Central government debt to GDP ratio increased to 82.9% at end 2018 from 76.9% at end 2017. Central government debt stock increased to rupees 11,977.5 billion at end 2018 due to the depreciation of the rupee, the relatively low nominal GDP, and net borrowings. Public sector debt, which includes the debt of the public enterprises, increased to 91.2% of GDP at end 2018 from 84.2% at end 2017. The Active Liability Management Act number 8 of 2018 was enacted in March 2018. This aims to strengthen the public debt management by addressing part of the refinancing requirements ahead of time, extending the maturity duration, and smoothing the repayment structure of international sovereign borrowings and other debt securities. Public sector debt increased in 2018 due to the weak financial performance of major state-owned business enterprises. CPC's profitability declined. CPC reported a loss of rupees 104 billion in 2018. This was largely due to the depreciation of the rupee and lower demand from the power generation sector. The financial performance of the CEB also remained weak. CEB recorded a loss of rupees 28.9 billion in 2018, and Sri Lankan Airlines financial performance also deteriorated affected, and SLA reported a operating loss of rupees 18.6 billion in 2018. Moving on to external sector developments. This gives a snapshot of the external sector in 2018. Sri Lanka's external sector experienced significant pressure in 2018 due to both domestic and external factors. This resulted in a widening of the current account deficit for last year. However, the financial account received significant inflows, and consequent policy measures adopted to curtail imports strengthened the external sector in early 2019. Sri Lanka's external sector at a glance, the trade deficit increased to 11.6% of GDP in 2018. The current account deficit increased to 3.2% of GDP in 2018 from 2.6% of GDP in 2017, and gross official reserves decreased to $6,919 million from $7,959 million in the previous year. 2018 witnessed the historically highest earnings from exports. Total exports in 2018 increased by 4.7% to $11,889.6 million. Higher export earnings were underpinned by the restoration of the EU GSP facility, conducive external trade policies together with strong institutional support, and the flexible exchange rate policy of the central bank. Expenditure on imports in 2018 also recorded the highest in history, despite the slowdown seen towards the end of the year. Total imports increased by 6% to $22,232.7 million in 2018. Import expenditure, which recorded a substantial growth during the first half of 2018, gradually decelerated as a result of policy measures adopted to curtail imports and the sharp depreciation of the Sri Lankan rupee. The higher growth in imports outpaced the increase in exports, widening the trade deficit. The trade deficit widened to $10,343 million in 2018. As a percentage of GDP, the trade deficit increased to 11.6%. However, the terms of trade improved marginally to 105.6 index points in 2018, as the export price index increased by 4.2%, while the import price index increased by only 4.1%. Western countries continued to be the main destinations for Sri Lankan exports, while Asia dominated Sri Lanka's imports. The USA continued to be the main buyer of Sri Lankan exports, followed by the UK. India and China continued to dominate as main import origins for Sri Lanka. Several measures were taken during 2018 to curtail high import expenditure to mitigate the adverse impact on the exchange rate. Measures were taken to curtail imports of gold, personal vehicles, and non-essential consumer goods. With regard to gold, a 15% customs duty was imposed in April. Personal vehicles, the excise duty was revised upward. The marginal deposit requirement was imposed against LCCs. Opening of LCs for importation of vehicles using concessionary permits was suspended, and loan-to-value ratios were reduced. With regard to non-essential consumer goods, 100% margin requirement on LC and DA terms in October 2018 was imposed, and restrictions were there to release forex in November 2018. These measures significantly reduced imports, particularly vehicles, in early 2019. The margin deposit requirement was removed in March 2019. The services account recorded a notable growth last year. Major contributors to the surplus in the services account included tourism, transport services, and computer services. In tourism, tourist earnings increased to US dollars 4,381 million. That's an annual growth of 11.6%. Tourist arrivals crossed the 2 million mark for the third time, reaching 2,333,796 arrivals. India, China, and the UK continued to be the key source markets. Inflows to the transport sector registered a growth of 6.2%, of which passenger fare earnings increased by 5.9% and freight earnings increased by 6.6%. In the computer services subsector, earnings increased by 7.9%. Remittances declined and the primary income account deficit widened marginally in 2018. Workers' remittances declined by 2.1% to US dollars 7,015 million in 2018. The downward trend in remittances can be attributed to geopolitical uncertainties in the Middle Eastern region, decline in overall labor migration. This involves the continuation of several government policy measures to discourage certain categories of female unskilled labor and the expansion in domestic employment opportunities. The deficit in the primary income account widened marginally to US dollars 2,399 million in 2018. The primary income account deficit increased due to higher dividend payments by direct investment enterprises and increased interest payments on foreign project loans obtained by the government. These developments expanded the current account deficit significantly in 2018. The current account deficit widened to US dollars 2,814 million last year. As a percentage of GDP, this was 3.2% compared to 2.6% in the previous year. The current account deficit widened due to the significant expansion of the trade deficit, the deficit in the primary income account, and the marginal decline in remittances. The financial account was augmented with higher inflows. Major inflows to the financial account in 2000 included FDI inflows, inclusive of foreign loans, which amounted to US dollars 2.1 billion. The issuance of the ISB, foreign currency term financing facilities, the fifth tranche under the IMFF, and project loan inflows to the government. Major outflows from the financial account in 2018 were net outflows from the treasury bond and SLDB market, maturity of the international bonds issued by the banking sector, repayment of project loans and foreign currency term financing facility, foreign loan repayments by private corporations and state-owned business enterprises. The combined outcome of the current and financial account resulted in a decline in gross official reserves by end 2018. Gross official reserves in 2018 were US dollars 6.9 billion, which was equivalent to finance 3.7 months of imports. Gross official reserves, however, reached a record high level of US dollars 9.9 billion in end April 2018 due to proceeds from two ISBs, proceeds from the Hambantota port, and the receipt of the fifth tranche of the IMF EFF. However, reflecting the impact of increased debt service payments and central bank intervention, gross official reserves declined by end 2018. The overall balance in the balance of payments in 2018 recorded a deficit of US dollars 1,103 million. The country's external debt stock increased marginally, while external debt payments also rose. The total external debt stock as at end 2018 was US dollars 52.3 billion. The debt stock increase, the external debt stock increased due to the increase in external debt of the general government, private sector corporations, and direct investment enterprises. External debt service payments also increased in 2018 to US dollars 5.9 billion. External debt service payments increased due to significant repayment of foreign liabilities of the government, maturity of international bonds issued by the banking sector, and higher interest payments on account of larger coupon payments of ISBs and interest payments on foreign loans of the government. The Sri Lankan rupee depreciated by 16.4% in 2018. This was largely due to outflows of foreign investments from the stock exchange and the government securities market, increased demand for foreign exchange by importers, and lack of dollar conversions by exporters, and unfavorable political developments. The central bank supplied US dollars 1,120 million on a net basis in 2018 to reduce the excessive intraday volatility in the exchange rate. However, in 2018, up to date, the exchange rate has appreciated. This has been due to policy measures adopted to curtail imports, moderation of outflows from the government securities market, and the pause in the rate hikes by the US Federal Reserve. Moving on to financial sector developments, the banking sector assets surpassed rupees 11 trillion during 2018, while deposits marked rupees 8.5 trillion. The growth of assets was mainly driven by credit growth. Profitability declined with a deterioration in asset quality, rise in operating costs, and increase in taxes. Capital and liquidity levels were well above the statutory minimum requirements. LFCs and SLCs performance moderated in 2018. The LFC and SLC sector performance moderated with low credit growth, declining profitability, and increase in non-performing loans. The slowdown in the sector was mainly due to fiscal and macroprudential policy measures and moderate economic growth. Financial markets remained volatile in line with the changing local and global economic environment. Prudential actions were taken by the central bank to strengthen the supervisory and regulatory framework of LFCs and SLCs, while reviving weak finance companies with the aim of maintaining the long-term stability of the sector. Stock market performance was poor in 2018 due to adverse developments in the domestic and global environment. The all-share price index decreased by 5% to 6,052.4 points at end 2018 from 6,369.3 points at end 2017. In the secondary market, foreign investments on a net basis deteriorated significantly to an outflow of rupees 23.1 billion as against an inflow of rupees 17.7 billion in 2017. Now the medium-term outlook as presented in the annual report. This gives the medium-term macroeconomic framework for the period 2019 to 2023. It's divided into 4 sectors. In the real sector, GDP growth is expected to increase to 4% in 2019 and gradually improve to around 5% thereafter. In the external sector is projected to strengthen over the medium term with improvements to the trade and services account. Revenue-based fiscal consolidation is expected to reduce the budget deficit and debt levels in the medium term, and monetary aggregates are expected to be maintained in line with economic activity. However, the medium-term macroeconomic framework published in the annual report was prepared before the Easter Sunday attacks. Although it is too early to conduct a comprehensive revision to the medium-term macroeconomic framework, the following variables are likely to be affected. Tourist arrivals and earnings will be significantly lower than projected. The negative spillover effects could be felt on related subsectors such as hotels and restaurants, transportation, entertainment and hospitality, food and beverages, trading and financial services. Accordingly, real GDP growth will be lower than projected. The current account deficit could be higher than projected, although performance in Q1 2019 indicates a lower than expected trade deficit. The fiscal deficit could be higher than projected, although expenditure switching could dampen the effect on the budget. Although there could be a short-term disruption to domestic food supplies, inflation is likely to remain at desired levels. The annual report also has discussed various issues and policies. For Sri Lanka to succeed as a higher income economy and improve the well-being of its people, it is essential that the root causes for the continued low economic growth are addressed by expediting the required structural reforms. The issues and policies discussed, therefore, in the annual report relate to the need to promote merchandise exports, removing barriers for further development in the tourism industry, attracting more FDIs to productive sectors, overcoming the bunching of foreign debt service payments, addressing concerns regarding public finance, developing economic infrastructure in tandem with envisaged growth path, exploiting the untapped potential in the industry sector, and getting accustomed to low nominal rates of interest. There are also several box articles in the annual report. The box articles relate to the impact of frequent large revisions to national accounts estimates on macroeconomic indicators and macroeconomic policy making, the national export strategy for the period 2018 to 2022, the need for a nationwide contributory pension scheme amidst a rapidly aging population, a stronger agriculture quarantine framework to improve the resilience of the agriculture sector, compiling property price indices and application to the condominium market in Sri Lanka, implementation of an international transactions reporting system, rebasing of the real effective exchange rate, maintaining a sufficient primary surplus to ensure a sustainable debt level over the medium term, and the choice of the inflation target for flexible inflation targeting in Sri Lanka, stability and sustainability of banks by strengthening the regulatory framework, evolution of the national payment system of Sri Lanka, anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism obligations for designated non-finance businesses and professions in Sri Lanka. Thank you.